All right, well, welcome back to this module. So now that we've gone through what syllogisms are and their parts and gone through examples of them, let's practice actually writing our own syllogisms so as to prove conclusions. It's going to be a really great skill set to learn, and we'll talk about that in a second. So when you're constructing your syllogism, I want you to follow four main steps. The first one is identify the conclusion. So in this module, your conclusions are going to be given to you, so you don't have to worry about coming up with them. But as a general rule of thumb, you need to know the point for which you're trying to prove or you're trying to argue toward if you're going to create an effective syllogism. So a classic example of that is a paper. You could say at the main point, the thing that you're trying to argue towards your conclusion is a thesis statement in a paper. That's the whole point of that a paper is trying to prove, is to prove that thesis statement. And so you can think of all the paragraphs in a paper as essentially putting forth different premises to help prove that thesis statement. And the quality of that paper comes from how well you can make connections between premises to deduce that the thesis statement is true. So in one way, a paper is one large syllogism, even made up of smaller syllogisms that try to prove the whole. So that would be an example of how you really need to define the point you're trying to prove your conclusion for your syllogism to be clear. For our purposes, our conclusions are going to be given to us for this module. Step 2, identify the minor and major terms. So you're not going to be able to write your major or minor premises without first determining your major and minor terms. These are going to come straight from your conclusion statement. So remember, the minor term is the subject of the conclusion statement, and the major term is the predicate, the verb, and the words that follow in the conclusion statement. Then identify your middle term. This might be the trickiest piece of creating a syllogism, but it is the most important piece. It's the key to a convincing syllogism, and it's really, you're trying to look for a term or phrase, a middle term can be a phrase, that naturally joins the major and minor terms together. Lastly, the major premise will be first followed by the minor premise and then the conclusion. The first part isn't always true. You can technically put the major or minor premise first. However, the rule that is always true is that the conclusion comes last. So we have our framework up here on the top of the page. Really, once you come up with your minor term, your major term, and your middle term, for a pretty basic syllogism, you kind of just plug and chug. So let's go through an example of following these four steps. So step 1, identify the conclusion. So we have a conclusion here for the purposes of our example already given to us, and the conclusion is courage is a virtue. So your conclusion is what you're trying to prove, and you work from the end to the front. So step 2, identify the major and minor terms. So remember, the minor term is the subject, the major term is the predicate. So in this statement, courage is the subject of the sentence, so courage is the minor term, and is a virtue is a predicate, so virtue is the major term. So we already have our minor and major terms. Step 3, identify the middle term. This is where it gets a little tricky. You have to think of, well, why do I think this conclusion is true? If you're struggling to figure out what middle term to use, think, well, why do I think the conclusion is true? Remember, a syllogism is trying to explain through deductive reasoning why a conclusion is true. Think of it as like a math problem where you have to show your work. It's not enough to simply say, 13 is the answer. Well, how did you get to 13 in the equation? You have to show out your work to show how you got there. This is essentially what a syllogism is doing. The conclusion is the answer, but writing the premises and then putting a good middle term that makes the connection between the two is essentially showing your work as to why the conclusion is true and is logical and follows. So think of it in that way. What term or phrase can I use to connect the major and minor term to show why it is logical that one follows into the other to prove the conclusion is true? So think, what connects the major and minor terms? In this case, when the conclusion is courage is a virtue, Well, why would it be logical to think that courage is a virtue? That might sound like a no-brainer. Well, of course, courage is a virtue. We've talked about courage. We've talked about virtue. We've talked about Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics and how virtue is a mean between excess and deficit. It's a rightly ordered habit. Well, stop there for a second and think about that. And, that sounds similar to what Socrates talked about courage is in the Socratic dialogues. So this process of making the connections in your mind and deducing step by step why something is true, this is essentially what you're writing out in your major and minor premise. You're showing the work. So let's focus on that connection. Well, you could deduce. Well, let's start. If we're going to answer why is courage a virtue, well, let's then start with what is a virtue. And virtue, simply put, are habits or dispositions aimed at doing the good. Remember, Aristotle talked about how virtue being a rightly ordered mean of between excess and deficit to aid us in reaching our ultimate purpose, happiness, the good. Well, courage fits that definition in a general way. So let's focus on, therefore, the definition of virtue as our middle term. So now you just have to put it all together in order to write your major and minor premises. So we put the middle term and the major term together. So in this case, we're going to use the definition of virtue as our middle term. We write all habits disposed to doing the good are called virtues. That is a true premise. To say that all habits that are disposed to doing the good are virtues, as opposed to habits disposed to doing bad or evil, those are vices. So that is a true statement. The minor premise, take the minor term and the middle term, and we put it together. Courage is a habit disposed of doing the good. Well, that is true. That courage does do that. Conclusion, therefore, courage is a virtue. This is an example of putting together a basic syllogism. So now we're going to practice. So we have our framework up top, and this is going to be the conclusion I'm going to ask you to practice, putting together a syllogism for. So we have the premise, slavery is morally wrong. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to pause your video and to write out a syllogism following the steps we just depicted to prove the statement that slavery is morally wrong. So go ahead and pause your video. All right, so I'm going to go through an answer I came up with. And if you haven't finished, please pause your video. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and go through it. All right, so first step, we have our conclusion. Slavery is morally wrong. Second step, identify your minor and major terms. So the subject of the sentence is slavery, so that's the minor term. Is morally wrong is the predicate, so that's our major term. Next, we're going to come up with a middle term. So we'll start thinking similar like we did with virtue. Well, what is slavery and what does it mean for something to be morally wrong? Well, morality has to deal with how do we responsibly use our freedom so as to reach our end of happiness. Well, freedom has to do with slavery, because what is slavery? Slavery is capturing humans, selling humans. When you do that, you're taking away their freedom. So notice as we're talking out loud, we're deducing, we're making connections. And a connection between slavery and something morally wrong, if we think logically, is freedom. Morality has to do with freedom. Slavery has to do with taking away freedom. So this idea of intentionally taking away someone's freedom, stealing someone's freedom, has to do with something being morally wrong. When we intentionally steal someone's freedom, that is wrong. That is a true statement. And that is what slavery is. So let's use that as our middle term, our middle phrase. It doesn't always have to be just one word, it can be a phrase. So let's put together our major premise. Middle term and major term. The intentional stealing of a person's freedom is morally wrong. That is true. When you steal when you steal a person's freedom, that is morally wrong. It's a good statement. Minor premise, put the minor term and the middle term together. Slavery, the act of capturing and selling humans, which is what slavery is intentionally stealing people's freedom. So it's a good statement. We're defining what slavery is and connecting it to what is morally wrong. Therefore, slavery is morally wrong. So it would follow, therefore, that slavery is morally wrong. So again, come up with a minor and major term out of the conclusion, deduce a middle term that connects both slavery and, or in this case, the minor term and major term, and shows the cause of the conclusion, and then put it all together. So at this point, I'm going to ask you to go over to your module post. I'm going to ask you to do two things. Number one, to explain what a syllogism is based on the first half of this module. And then you're going to be given 3 conclusions for which you're to write a syllogism for each, proving those conclusions to be true using the methods that we just used here.